Well, what does the short-term future look like for LSU? What about the long-term future? And what about the short and long-term future for the NCAA as a whole? John Garcia, insider for recruiting for Sports Illustrated, joins us on the show to break all of that down and more on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and we're also available on YouTube. So whenever you go on YouTube, you want to watch the podcast, press that subscribe button, and you'll get notified as soon as the podcast drops so you don't miss a second of Locked on LSU content. I am Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every week, and I am joined this week again by our friend John Garcia Jr., a recruiting insider for Sports Illustrated. Let's just get into it because we have so much to look into today, John. First and foremost, I want to look at kind of the long-term future in terms of LSU, looking at some of the recruits. I saw that you put out a wonderful article on Sports Illustrated about Caden Jones, a tackle out of New Orleans, out of Baton Rouge's backyard, a really big guy, huge physical tackle. LSU's on his list, but isn't necessarily on the short list. We look at Texas. We look at Texas A&M. He has some familial ties to A&M. Florida State was thrown out there as well. Two-parter. What kind of a player is he? What can he bring to the table? And is LSU in his sights?
Well, as you mentioned, Caroline, he's massive, 6'7", 6'8". I was in New Orleans interviewing him, feeling very short, under 6 foot. But yeah, this is an interesting player. He's developed a ton over the last year. I met him about a year ago when he was kind of this early emerging, massive tackle out of De La Salle High School. But he had some baby weight, certainly, needed to reshape his body. And he's begun that process in a really strong way. Now he's about 315, really looks the part as a true offensive tackle, and his scholarship offer list has grown as a result. As you mentioned, LSU is right there in the mix. I mean, look, he's a New Orleans kid. Everybody knows LSU has to do well local and hyper local, and that really starts really in New Orleans more so than Baton Rouge, although Baton Rouge talent has been picking up steam over the last decade or so. But with Caden, he was at the spring game, certainly liked his time there. Didn't get a lot of time with Brian Kelly, so I think that could have been by design, maybe to get him back to campus later in the offseason. Again, the proximity certainly helps, but he did spend a lot of time with Brad Davis, the offensive line coach, and really had a lot of nice things to say about not only his style and watching him coach the LSU O-line, but kind of in the opportunity that he's presenting. Like, hey, this is a group that is going to have young guys playing in 2022, which means it's probably going to have young guys playing in 2023. And that's something Caden really locked in on beyond the general appeal of LSU being the in-state school and really the only local school that is heavy on him. But as you mentioned, other schools are absolutely in this thing. He has family ties to A&M, where his mom attended school. His uncle played for the Aggies in the early 2000s. And that's kind of his football mentor. So there's no doubt that Texas A&M is going to factor into this thing. And he visited earlier this spring, got the offer from Jimbo Fisher, which really meant a lot to him. So I think LSU and A&M are going to stay in the race, get multiple visits going forward. And then there's Texas, which is kind of the wild card to me. There wasn't a whole lot of communication between UT and Caden. And then he was playing like NBA 2K one day, and then they were told, hey, Steve Sarkisian wants to talk to you. They get on FaceTime. He gets the offer, and it was certainly memorable from that standpoint. So as you mentioned, LSU's right in there, but there is work to be done in terms of keeping him within state lines. The good news for LSU is that he hasn't taken any official visits or set any to date. So I do think he'll get at least one more intimate visit with LSU before all is said and done, but you would expect A&M and Texas to also get official visits. And then the Florida schools are in that conversation too. Florida and Florida State both hosted him in March, and he came away with positive impressions of both programs. So it's going to be an SEC-ACC battle, semi-regional for Caden, but LSU is absolutely going to be a factor for him. And when we start to look at Brian Kelly's first full class, the in-state tally, if you will, the scorecard is really going to be important, because we talked about it a lot as they ended the 22 cycle, but noticeably, LSU was behind, right? New coaching staff trying to catch up on some of these recruits. So it was almost excusable to have some hits and misses. That won't be the case in the class of 23. And Caden Jones, at least on the offensive line, is going to be one of these top tier prospects that we sort of inadvertently judge Brian Kelly by. So that will be an important recruitment to track.
When you mentioned LSU's in the mix with Texas A&M, the Florida schools, that sounds like it's pretty par for the course for every other 4 or 5-star recruit coming out of high school in the next couple of years. But you mentioned he was at the LSU spring game, and I did read that in your article that he cited that he saw Will Campbell, for example, starting on the offensive line, and that was really attractive to him because he said, I want to start right away. I want to leave college early, and I want to be able to make it to the NFL as soon as I possibly can. Do you think that that's a trend that could be attractive to several other recruits? I know that the offensive line is the obvious tie here. He sees true freshmen starting on the offensive line in the spring game. Is that something that's attractive to one other offensive lineman, and could it trickle down to other position groups as well?
Absolutely. When you turn over a coaching staff, there's an inherited group of kids, obviously, and then you recruit another group. And as those groups come together, you're kind of creating the impressions at that moment. There's not a whole lot before that point that Brian Kelly's staff is going to consider with some of these players. So naturally, younger guys and guys that you have identified as a coaching staff, all things even, are probably going to get the benefit of the doubt. So that certainly leans towards younger players seeing the field sooner, particularly year 1, year 2, year 3, under Kelly, which would, of course, overlap with Caden Jones entering the college game. So that's going to be attractive really to all LSU targets. I mean, there's across the board, when you talk about the natural recruiting rivals that LSU has, and we've talked about a few of them, they're more established. They're more stable. Certainly when you get to Alabama, Georgia, Texas A&M, they've all been there at least 2 years. So in that regard, they have more talent, more depth at the top, and more built-in relationships with their current staff, as opposed to Kelly inheriting a lot of talent, yes, but still players that he didn't necessarily have his fingerprints on before he took the job. So there's going to be a youth movement in general for all these transition schools, and with the talent in the LSU SEC West footprint, that pushes even more young guys on the field in my mind. And I think that's not such a bad thing as you're trying to turn this thing around.
And you said in the state of Louisiana, New Orleans is just so rich with high school football talent. In addition to Caden, who else in the New Orleans area, or even just in Louisiana in general, should LSU fans kind of have on their radar?
Well, I mean, it starts at the very top with Arch Manning. I know, Eli Holstein's also in state. The quarterback position is still very much TBD for LSU. Arch finally spoke to some members of the media on Monday, and he said, look, it's the top 3 schools everybody's been talking about, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, they do exist, and they're probably going to get official visits. But he also mentioned that he might take some unofficial visits to schools that have new coaching staffs, a la LSU, a la Florida, which, of course, that staff has a lot of ties to the state. So I still think you've got to shoot your shot with Arch Manning. The quarterback position in the state, however, is very loaded. It's not just Arch. You got Ricky, the Purdue verbal commitment in Baton Rouge. He's committed elsewhere. I think that one could get interesting down the line. And then there's still Eli Holstein, a kid who is another talented in-stater, former Texas A&M commitment. Looks like Alabama's in the driver's seat right now, but Bama's also courting Arch Manning. So as those quarterback dominoes form, that could create some movement with Holstein looking at schools like Florida, LSU, or maybe even A&M for a second time. So it's always going to start at the quarterback position for me. And I think Brian Kelly is doing that locally and trying to stay in the mix with some of these quarterbacks, but he's also doing it nationally, which is, I think, very smart in his approach. Dante Moore just took an official visit. Jaden Rashada is a Californian who has been linked to LSU and has already been to campus. So the quarterback position, those 5 guys in particular, you got to grab one of them in my mind if you're LSU, and they're at a minimum going to get 4 of them on campus. So that's a pretty good start. But obviously the state of Louisiana per capita, I think, is the number 1 NFL talent production state per capita. So
it is, which is kind of shocked me.
Right. I mean, so obviously the talent, you have to keep them home. There's really no other way to look at it. And just like we talked about with Ed Orgeron and Les Miles all the way back, when you're battling Nick Saban in particular, who's had the most success in Louisiana, you have to hold him off for some of these top prospects, particularly in New Orleans and in the northern part of the state as well, where they've had a lot of success over the last few years.
And you bring up the biggest elephant in the recruiting room, and that's obviously Arch Manning. His entire process has been pretty hush-hush, which just kind of goes along with kind of the Manning way. They don't want to divulge too much information. He's not on social media. He's done very few media appearances. But you say that LSU could be on his radar, and it's the same. It's the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Texases that have, been tied so closely with Arch Manning. But since we don't know a ton about him, we haven't heard a lot from him. If you know by any chance, what are his priorities? What is he looking for in his ultimate landing spot? Because it seems like his landing spot could be wherever he wants to go.
That last part is what makes this thing so interesting. Nobody's going to say no or try to rush Arch Manning. So that could, one, extend his timeline and, alter some of the priorities in his recruitment. He certainly is looking for that true high-end professional organizational atmosphere. He wants an NFL type of system. And obviously Brian Kelly's been linked to the NFL for, it seems like, a decade at this point. So I do think that if they could get him on campus, that would be a positive in the presentation. They want stability. They want a program that could either maintain its status near the top, which is, Alabama, Georgia makes a lot of sense, or one that is clearly on the up and up. And I think that's where Texas, maybe an LSU and a Florida can actually factor into this recruitment. So they also want some quarterback history and development. Obviously, LSU under previous regimes has been able to do that. I mean, you don't have to sell Joe Burrow very, very much compared to other schools and their marquee guy. But this is a new coaching staff. So I think that would really be kind of where LSU appears to be behind the eight ball, is establishing, hey, this is our plan at quarterback. This is what we want to do with this LSU offense going forward. So I think those are the things that you would have to sell if and when he gets down to Baton Rouge for a visit to try to stay in this race. So we all know, like you mentioned with Jones, this is about Saturdays into Sundays, not just playing college football. So they want to be molded into that direction. But his timeline being kind of up and down could give LSU and Florida a little bit more time to get involved here. If you get one visit, the next step is trying to get another, trying to get one of those official visits. And right now, look, Arch said it yesterday. He's like, look, I don't know where I'm going right now, because if I did, I would commit. I'm not,
Right.
He's not trying to play games with this thing. So he still has a lot of questions to ask in general. And I think it's a combination of solidifying his feelings on those top three schools, but also leaving the door just slightly open for LSU, for Florida, and maybe others that we're not even talking about at this point. So if there's enough curiosity, they'll take the trip. And then you go from there knowing stability is important, development is important, and that kind of trajectory of being better going forward, critical in this Manning decision that could come, as soon as the summer or as late as, into the season, maybe even all the way towards signing day. Who knows? If anybody can do it, it would be Arch Manning.
We talk about potential LSU players a few years down the road, but what about the players now in the near future? New LSU players coming in through the transfer portal. What does LSU's transfer portal look like now that eligibility, that post May 1st eligibility is closed? I want to get into that after a couple words from our sponsors. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now, make sure to go check out Locked On NBA Big Board. Host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter is joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Leif Thulin, giving fans an in-depth look at the NBA draft, mock draft, player rankings, and of course, the big boards. It is free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Caroline Fenton joined by John Garcia, insider of recruiting at Sports Illustrated. Now, I saw this article put out by CBS Sports on 247sports.com, and it's kind of ranking the top transfer portal schools in the country. Of course, USC at the top, and they did a point ranking system. USC with 85 points, Ole Miss coming in that second spot with 82, and LSU ultimately in that third spot with 72 points, kind of a further away from Ole Miss. I want to get into the LSU side of things, but looking at LSU's SEC West rival in Ole Miss, what is so special about this Ole Miss transfer portal class? Of course, we're looking at Jackson Dart. Probably can assume he'll be the starting quarterback for Ole Miss come the fall. But outside of Jackson Dart, what's so special about Ole Miss's transfer class?
Yeah, I think when you get a quarterback who could be the starter, that always kind of sprinkles in the perception at a high level. But really, it's elsewhere for Ole Miss. I think the skill positions on offense, in particular, are about as good as it can be. Zach Evans was arguably him and Jahmyr Gibbs, maybe the top two running backs in the transfer portal. Ole Miss grabs him, the former TCU running back, and I think he could really be the key to the offense, regardless of who wins that quarterback battle. So that certainly gave them points on any scale. And then Michael Trey, I mean, watch the spring game at Ole Miss. I think he had 2 or 3 touchdowns, big physical hybrid tight end receiver type who also came from USC and is close friends with Jackson Dart. That's really the element of the Ole Miss passing game that we really hadn't seen of late under Lane Kiffin. It has always been about wide receivers, running backs, slot receivers. All of those positions have had success, even early on at Ole Miss. But the tight end has kind of been up and down for him. And I think this is the type of kid that can help transition that and make Ole Miss that much harder to defend in the passing game. And then defensively, I thought they filled some nice holes with some role-playing type players, particularly on the defensive line. I mean, J.J. Pegues, big Auburn defensive tackle, tight end who played both sides of the ball. I think he'll be a D lineman at Ole Miss. They lost some players in the portal there, so they needed to replace some, and they got some with SEC West experience, which is pretty nice. But hey, LSU did that as well with some guys too.
Yeah, and you mentioned the quarterback, and of course, in this article, they say Jaden Daniels, and if he does end up being the starting quarterback, then hey, that's a slam dunk in LSU's transfer portal tally. And of course, Jaden Daniels is the most obvious one. But who else outside of the quarterback position do you think is going to be able to come in from LSU's transfer portal class and make the biggest impact?
It could be, I believe they got the FIU offensive tackle transfer, Miles Frazier. I could see him being a truly important piece. We talked about earlier how the O-line is going to be super young and inexperienced. So bringing in a player who's got multiple levels, all-American level experience, even in the group of 5, I think will be critical to bridge the gap between the old regime and the new regime. So that's kind of an easy instant impact transfer. Obviously, Daniels, if he wins the job, that speaks for itself. But I think there's some key guys elsewhere that are going to fit in quite quickly. I mean, Joe Faucha, I think in the secondary, a guy who has a ton of experience, also coming in from the SEC West in Arkansas, New Orleans native.
Bernard Converse as well.
Yep, that's another one. I mean, the secondary obviously has gone through a ton of transition. So replacing those guys is going to be key. But Faucha in particular, you need that nickel guy. You need that player who can play the run a little bit, play physical, but also has that instincts and savvy to play underneath in the passing game and take chances. And I think he brings a lot of that aggression that we see when LSU is at its best. It has that nickel type guy, obviously the Honey Badger being maybe the greatest of all time at the collegiate level. So I think he'll factor in as well. And I think, bringing stability in the running back room, I thought was really, really important. We've seen transition in and out for LSU. So bringing a Baton Rouge native home, I thought was a really big deal with Noah Cain, the Penn State transfer coming in. Big physical downhill back, which is something that with Ty Davis Price having moved on, that's something that you maybe don't have in the current group. Armani Goodwin's a little bit smaller. Emery is more of a space guy, really strong pass catcher. So you need kind of that hammer, that short yardage guy, that downhill guy, and I think they could have brought him in there with Cain. So I think all over the place, this LSU transfer class is going to do something right out of the gate. And then some of those other guys, as the season goes on, are going to have to make an impact as well. Again, when you talk about bringing in your own guys with college experience, Brian Kelly's not bringing them in to play third string. They're going to see the field more times than not.
And I've seen throughout this entire offseason that Lane Kiffin has gotten the label of transfer portal king. What makes him so good at wanting people to play for Ole Miss?
I mean, I think that's part of it. It's the public persona. He has sold himself.
Definitely has that. That is for certain.
Right. He has sold himself as much as Ole Miss or as much as, his offensive resume. He is selling, hey, you can come here and have fun. He does all the hashtags, party and the sip. I think Transfer Portal King is like his own creation. He wears the T-shirts. He was driving around a transfer prospect in a Rolls Royce a couple weeks ago. I mean, it's just totally public. And I think that's really the biggest difference between a Lane Kiffin and a Brian Kelly. The Brian Kelly stuff becomes public when recruits put it out, like the video around the swivel thing, stuff like that.
Not necessarily as cool as Lane Kiffin's.
Right, right. But his is such, so successful, so consistent over the long haul. It's more of a business versus a fun kind of wide open element. So it's just a different sell. Some kids will say, "Hey, I'm making a business decision. I want, everybody to be serious at all times." And a school like LSU will fit that type of recruit, which really hasn't been the case compared to the last two coaching staffs in town. So it kind of shows you can win with both sides of the equation, but clearly the administration at LSU wanted to get a little bit more serious, a little bit more organizationally sound, and that's what Brian Kelly is really good at beyond recruiting and the X's and O's.
Oh, absolutely. That's kind of what we've heard from him throughout his tenure so far at LSU is he's become the CEO of practice, that it is so regimented, that it is so organized, which is a wonderful switch up from kind of what some of our coaching staffs of the past. But coming up next, there's some massive changes in NIL. How exactly will that affect recruiting? I want to get into that with John coming up next. But before I do that, I want to tell you about our partners at BetOnline, who continue to be the #1 source for all of your betting needs and sports information. You can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, and even next year's NFL futures. You also can check out some of their college football futures. I've seen that LSU currently sits at 50-1 odds to win the SEC. That's a long shot, but if you believe in the Tigers, then sprinkle some money on it while the odds are in your favor. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today and use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, John, there have been some massive changes in NIL. So it's come out that the NCAA says that boosters can no longer use these collectives in order to create these packages to get recruits to want to come. It's kind of felt like NIL, name, image, and likeness, has turned into essentially pay to play. I have so many questions and so many thoughts on it. But my first question is, didn't the NCAA create this for themselves? What did they expect when NIL became a part of the NCAA? Now they're basically revoking something that they said was okay.
Yeah, and remember, Caroline, this NIL began July 1st of 2021, so
We're less
not
than
even
a year removed.
not even a year in. They're like, hold on, let us
Pump the brakes.
overcorrect like we always seem to do at the NCAA level. Of course, boosters were going to get involved. This was designed to live outside of the coaching staff in particular and outside of the school in particular. So naturally, who do you think are going to be the group that is most likely to put money together and rally with a very pointed, target audience? I mean, obviously the boosters, the people who care and have the financial means most compared to others to actually do something about making changes. So that was obviously a huge oversight by the NCAA on the front end of this thing. So now you're overcorrecting. And what got me about the report that was released on Monday was they're going to potentially retroactively look into some of these kids that have made decisions and how much these collectives were involved, when at the time it was kind of legal for them to be involved, at least through a third party or a middleman. So now they're trying to crack down on that, and the coaches can't have as much communication with these groups. But again, just like we talked about 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, before I was even born, you can't really police all of that. The communication is going to exist, and these boosters, these collectives are still going to know, hey, these are the priorities with school X. So trying to get in the middle of that and prove what communication happened between, the coaching staff and those groups is going to be, chasing a ghost, for lack of a better phrase. So the NCAA, again, overcorrects and then wants to get into something that is basically unattainable in terms of trying to prove. So I do think that, change was necessary. I'm not sure if this first step was the best step, but I do think that most in the college athletics departments and in recruiting in general, they do agree that something needs to happen with some of these collectives in terms of the timing. But again, trying to prove when contact was initiated, or assuming that recruiting is going to happen where these kids, particularly transfers who are older, who have agents legally and who have more advising counsel, for them to make moves without knowing what's possible in NIL is going to be a tough assumption to push back against. They're still going to know exactly what is afforded to them if and when they pick a certain school. That's always been a part of recruiting. And I think even with these changes, that will continue. So I don't know in the end how much it'll change in terms of if a kid will now look at another school versus the school that they initially picked, unless, of course, the NCAA finds and proves something that we don't see coming.
But I guess that's my next question is how in the world is this going to be policed? How is this going to be enforced? Because if there's one thing that I've found about college football boosters or really just college football organizations as a whole, if there's a rule, they're going to find a loophole to it. So, I mean, the NCAA all day long can say boosters don't do that, but it kind of feels a little bit silly because what's stopping the booster from, handing X amount of millions of dollars to a local restaurant or a local business and saying, hey, give this to so-and-so.
Exactly, which is really the same old school pay for play that you referenced earlier. I mean, that's how it's always gone. It's never
Right.
been as direct as a movie or anything else would make it seem like. It's never that direct because you're probably not a millionaire if you don't know how to navigate obstacles anyway. So
Right.
exponentially build that out to all these schools with amazing resources, and it becomes that much more meticulous, that much more smooth of an operation. So I just think, yeah, policing it is a totally different thing. We knew they had to make some changes and try to be bold, and this was certainly bold from the NCAA's perspective, but enforcing it and or actually creating change down the road, it's really hard to imagine much of it coming from what came out on Monday. But most, again, want to see kind of any change at this point. So I guess in that light, it was a tiny step in the right direction.
Last one for you, John. I mean, we've seen NIL change recruiting significantly. How do you think this could change recruiting, if at all?
I don't think a whole lot. I think, there'll be a little bit more careful communication. Maybe compliance is involved just a little bit more with NIL collectives, which is, I know, something that was already starting under NIL in general, because these kids, for the most part, had to have these deals, scoured by compliance anyway. So I do think that will become a bit more of a meticulous process. And maybe that was the end game goal of the NCAA, just to make these schools a little bit more careful and try to hold the coaches accountable a little bit more. But look, I mean, these coaches operate in gray areas for a living in recruiting. So something like this, I don't think will push them too far off of that path, one direction or the other. So I don't think it changes a whole lot as long as these NIL collectives are doing it the right way. And again, there's really no way to prove if they're not doing it the right way unless they, start tweeting at recruits like fans do. But we don't see that happening yet in the first year. So why would we expect that going forward?
Classic inconsistencies and gray areas from the NCAA. Same stuff, different day. John Garcia, appreciate you very much. We'll chat with you next week.
Sounds good, Caroline. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you. Well, coming up tomorrow on Locked On LSU, well, I want to break down a little bit more what John said about NIL because the changes have been astronomical and so incredibly crazy and very difficult to follow. So we'll break that down as well as some LSU baseball recap as well. But that's going to do it for me today on Locked On LSU. Appreciate you for making the podcast your first listen every day. And make your second listen Locked On SEC. You can get all of your daily SEC news in less than 30 minutes with SEC expert Chris Gordy. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts.